get started.
And are we expecting anybody else, Erin, or do you think this is who we're getting?
I believe this is it. Thanks
Okay.
for joining us tonight, Rachel.
Not a problem. I will have my camera on in just a couple minutes, trying to get a couple things finished so my child will actually eat dinner tonight.
No worries.
And do me a favor, the person whose last name I think is Wimmer, what is your first name?
Apologies, Zachary.
Zachary, thank you. I
Zachary
didn't want to
Weimer.
say like Weimer. I didn't want to, mispronounce your name, and so I appreciate it. Thank you, Zachary, and hello, Robert. How you doing? Okay, so tonight we are continuing the discussion of some of the different strategies, the different strategic actions in the housing production strategy for supporting affordable housing development. And our intention is by the next meeting, we'll have just a few more actions to talk to you about, and we'll begin putting everything together. So we'll have brought you enough information to start having intelligent discussions, informed discussions about these different actions and how they can be used. And then we'll start putting together okay, so what does this mean? We have, this much potential actions that might cost these amounts. And we've got this much potential funding that can fit in different ways. And I'm imagining that there will be a mismatch. And so then I think some of the discussion of equity will start to come up through the next meeting, and that'll also be following through the following meetings. So I think you probably all have our agenda. I'll just toss it up on the screen for a moment, which is to do a brief review, which I'll run through the review. And then we're going to discuss the multiple unit tax exemption. We've got a little presentation of the information we sent you. And then the discussion is questions. Anything that we haven't said that you want to know about. The same thing for system development charges, and the same thing for use of urban renewal funds. All right. So before I go on, does that all sound okay to everybody? All right, I'm going to switch on the PowerPoint that I've got on my screen. Are you guys all seeing the PowerPoint? Okay. I'm going to switch that on, and that's going to, oh, everything didn't get messed up. Perfect. So we've got three more meetings after this, one coming up in November, and then we'll be bringing you back beginnings of the draft plan in January and more in February. We will be discussing this, I forget the exact dates, but with the City Council and the Planning Commission coming up. I don't think we've got the public workshop planned out yet. And I may actually suggest that we move that to task 3 and do that sometime out in January. We haven't had those discussions yet. So that's where we are right now.
Hey Beth, just as a point of order to interject for time management purposes, is it okay if folks just raise their hand with questions or throw them in the chat, or would you prefer they reserve them for the end?
No, I like questions as we go.
Okay.
Mary and Corinne, are you okay with that? Because they're actually going to be doing more of the presentation. Okay.
Thank you.
So questions as we go. All right, so what we're trying to do is partially implementation of the housing production strategy. So describing the actions that are particularly related to things that need funding or that bring in revenue, and examining the implementation of these selected strategies. So some of these things require the beginnings of, I'm not going to say decisions, but you certainly have to make some decisions and assumptions in modeling out what they may be. So it may well be that some of the things we're talking about here, the City Council, as it's implementing separate actions, may choose to implement a little differently than what we're talking about, but hopefully we'll be providing enough information to start some of those discussions. The goals of the project are about reducing financial and regulatory impediments to development of housing, and especially development of housing that's affordable at below 80% of median family income. So that's affordable to essentially people who work and live in Tualatin. Creating financial and regulatory incentives, that's the actions we're talking about and how to balance those. And then identifying and figuring out how certain resources could be accessed and available to support development of affordability of needed housing. We're all talking all about needed housing, all of it is. So we wanted to give you a little bit of a visual for what we're talking about. So if you are building, you are the developer of, say, a market rate housing development. So that's a housing development that maybe the rents are targeted to be affordable to a household that has 80% of the median family income. Let me look at the next slide. 80% of median family income. This is 2020 data, I think, but would be for a family of four, $74,000 and affording rents at $1,850 per month. So I am the developer of market rate housing. I'm a private developer. I'm just building multifamily housing. And I want to do what the city is asking me to do, which is have some units or maybe all of my units affordable at $1,800 a month or less. And of course, that amount varies depending on the size of the units. So studios, one-person households, the rent level would be different than for a four-person household. So I want to do what the city's asking. Well, that's going to create a funding gap, because actually building that housing and including the profit that developers require to build that housing means that my rents would be higher. And we'll explain to you some of the ways in that rents might be higher as we go along. So we've got a funding gap, and maybe the gap is bigger than this in some cases, maybe it's smaller than this in some cases. But what we're talking about are things to fill that gap. Many of the aside from urban renewal today, the tax exemption and the system development charge exemption that we're talking about are ways to help fill that funding gap. And then our funding sources are how we pay for these things. Okay, so just a reminder of what's considered affordable. We're generally speaking talking at 80% or less of median family income. So a household that could afford about $1,850 a month in rent. Remember, this is a couple of years old, so the numbers are a little bit higher now. When you think about housing for low-income households, you think about income restricted affordable housing. That's typically at 60% or less median family income. Well, here we've got an example of 50%. So a household that earns $46,000 and can afford about $1,150 a month in monthly housing costs. And as I remember it, and I don't have the data right in front of me, certainly this kind of housing that's affordable there isn't built by private developers. That's exclusively built by affordable housing developers, so income restricted affordable housing. We're not talking about this kind of housing up here that the housing market is doing either for rental or for home ownership, even if this higher cost housing home ownership is still tough for a lot of households. Generally speaking, we're talking here and we're talking ownership and rental housing. All right. So this is a list of all of the strategies we'll be considering in this. The ones in green are things that bring in revenue, so money sources. The things in blue are what goals they sit under. So we're going through all of these as part of this project. Last time we hit the low-income housing property tax exemption, which, Steve, did you tell me the other day that that the city just adopted this?
Yeah, it was just adopted last month, and so it was the city portion of property tax, and so a future action would be to expand that to include probably the school, the Tiger Walton School District, at least for that portion of the city that's in that district, so as to affect a complete waiver of that.
So that'll be a bigger incentive and more help for developing that.
Yeah, and
This-
that would be a recommended action from this group potentially.
I think that's a good recommended action. Not that I'm sure that my opinion matters here, sorry. So this is a tax exemption for income restricted housing. Today, we're talking about a tax exemption, the multiple unit property tax exemption for privately developed, that middle sort of housing. We're also talking today about the system development charges. And let's see. And we've combined these in a little bit different way. We'll be talking next time about rehabilitation programs and local contributions to an affordable housing development. What else can we find money in other words? And we're also talking today about urban renewal. So a review of what we talked about previously, the construction excise tax. It would levy a tax on new construction to fund housing programs and investments. It can be on housing up to 1% of the permit value. Or it can also be on commercial or industrial development. And there's not a fixed percentage, but of course, the city would want to be careful that its construction excise tax for those wasn't a disincentive for development. So it allows the city to collect a certain amount of the permit value for new development. And then that funding can be used to support a variety of different affordable housing types of projects. We also looked at the low-income nonprofit, the nonprofit low-income housing tax exemption, and we just talked about that. And the city is on its way to doing that. Right now, it's only exempting city taxes, but if the city gets the school district on board, it would be 51% or more of the total tax roll, and so it exempt all taxes. And we'll talk about that concept a little bit more as we talk about MUPD here today. So that's what we've talked about so far. Before we go into MUPD, are there any questions? All right, I'm gonna, oh, yes, please, Susan.
If you don't mind, I have a question because it's been so long since our first meeting. And forgive me for asking this, but I'm a bit confused. I read the packet that Aaron sent out for this meeting, and just listening to your introduction, Beth. How many on this committee right now are considered consultant or staff? I think I count 5. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And how many of us are residents or of Tualatin that you're asking us to make decisions? Are there 4 of us? Are there 5 of us?
I don't remember where what Rachel is representing.
I am with SEPA. We're an affordable housing developer that works in Washington County, including a project that's currently gearing up for construction closing in Tualatin.
Okay. I'm just right now, this all feels very overwhelming to be asked to help make a decision on how we can have affordable housing with this criteria. Is it going to get better as we go along, that we're going to understand, or at least I'm going to understand the information and be able to absorb it and make some good decisions?
I hope so. That's the intention.
Okay.
So the idea is to give you the information up front about what each of these different programs do, to talk about how they can work together as we're going along a little bit, and then to talk about how these might fit together in terms of equity, and how the city might implement this in terms of equity. So I don't think it's important for you to know all of the details, say about the nonprofit low-income tax exemption versus the MUPD tax exemption, the multi-unit. It is important for you to know that one of them is for lower income housing and the other one's for, a little bit higher
Mhm.
income housing. And that they help by reducing property tax costs as the building is operated. So that's the level of information that I think it's helpful for you to have fully absorbed.
Okay.
Is that a reasonable ask, Susan?
Yes, it is. And thank you. I just needed a little clarification so I could be responsible sitting on this committee. So thank you very much.
And I would say if at the end of the next meeting, if what you're sitting there is drowning in information and just not sure how to start talking about the different questions we'll be bringing, then let's talk about what we need to get you to help you get there. And it may be that it's just a private conversation where we answer some questions. And so that emphasizes that one of the things we need to bring next time, which we've been talking about, is a simple summary of the different actions. So,
Okay.
and we've also got members of the committee who aren't here, I think, Erin. I was looking at the invitation, and that included a number of other people.
That's true. I believe we're missing two people that had originally accepted the meeting invite. I want to say that maybe one resident or gentleman has decided to exclude himself from the advisory committee without maybe necessarily stating so. And then our budget and finance director will disseminate this video and information back to him, and hope to get him on the next meeting so that we can get his participation as well.
So while he is staff, he's also a committee member for helping with the discussion and some of the decisions, and talking about from his perspective related to Tualatin's budget, what some of the pros and cons are.
Correct.
Okay. Some of the things that we're going to talk about, Susan, are just way more complicated, for instance, than I understand all the details of, but I don't have to understand all the details of them. So.
Okay. I appreciate it. Thanks very much.
No worries. Are there other questions or concerns before we go on? Okay, I'm going to hand it over to, I think, Mary, and she's going to tell us about the multiple unit property tax exemption.
Yep, thanks, Beth. So I'm going to be talking about MUPD, which is a tool that is similar in some ways to the nonprofit tax exemption that we just talked about a little bit from the last session. So that they're similar in that they can both be used to remove some of the ongoing costs for developers in order to incentivize targeted types of housing that the city wants to see more of. So specifically, it does this by removing costs associated with, in MUPD's case, land value taxes. And that's generally available for up to 10 years and can potentially last longer for affordable housing projects. So here we're talking about its use for affordable housing, although it is very flexible and it doesn't always have the same criteria between different cities in Oregon. In the discussion that we're going to get into, it talks about 20% of units in a building being earmarked for affordable housing. And we'll get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of that in the next couple of slides. But like the nonprofit tax exemption, the city can also choose to offer the exemption on its own taxes for just its share of the tax roll, which is 16.5%, or if it gets enough taxing districts to sign on, then it would apply to 100% of those land value taxes only. So later on, we'll have a slide that breaks down what share different districts have in that tax roll. But one example would be the school district and the city together make up 61% of the taxes collected. And if both of those signed on, it would automatically apply to 100%. We go to the next slide, please. So just to clarify a little bit how these two are different in broad strokes, not necessarily the nitty gritty details. The nonprofit low income tax exemption serves a deeper affordability level. So generally it's people who are at 60% of the area median income or lower. And then MUPD fits in this middle area for people who are around 80% of area median income.
And Mary, I'm gonna stop you for a moment. Area median income, AMI, MFI, they're interchangeable terms. They mean the exact same thing. So when Mary is talking about AMI, it's the same thing that we see in this slide, these same numbers. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Do you know what
so-
that new number is for now? I see it's 2 years old, but do we know what it is for this time?
I think it's at 100%, I think it's $96,000 for a household of 4. So it's a little higher than it is in the data we have for this. But the reason that we use a percentage of median family income or AMI is because these things change over the years. And so the percentage means that you're targeting the same income groups.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. And when we talk about a little bit more of the details, we'll see what that actually means for what the rent prices are set at with MUPD. But one of the important distinctions between these two is that MUPD the goal is to incentivize mixed income housing that we often refer to as workforce housing by market rate developers. So it's getting developers who might not be thinking about adding affordable units to have a reason to add them into their development. Whereas nonprofit low-income tax exemption is generally targeting nonprofit developers and helping them close that gap like we saw earlier with the capital stack of all the different resources that go into an affordable housing development. It's helping them lower that bar. But the one that we're going to be talking about is a flexible program that tries to get market rate developers to make mixed income housing. It's a little bit more flexible too, because you can set it at different levels. But specifically, we're going to talk about developments that would have 20% of their units set at that same affordability level, that 80% of the area's median income, and what would be affordable to those renters.
But there's lots of different ways that cities can configure this and lots of different requirements, and cities all over the state are using this tool. So in different ways.
Yeah. And can we go to the next slide? So looking specifically at Tualatin, we have highlighted here the share that the city is of that entire tax roll, and it's 16.5%. So on its own, if the city decided to implement MUPD, it could offer an exemption for 16.5% of a development's taxes. But if they managed to push it over 51% in that share, then it would automatically apply to all of the taxing districts. So you can see here some of those bigger ones like the school district and Washington County that would be big pieces that could make that come together. With the nonprofit tax exemption and MUPD, it's important in different ways because MUPD is again trying to incentivize developers to do something that they might not be thinking about otherwise. So offering as big of an exemption as possible helps to make it feasible to add those affordable units. If we jump to the next slide, that would mean reducing rents to be affordable to people at 80% of the median income. So the first column shows the residential market rate rents without MUPD, what they would be on an example building that we looked at that was recently built in Tualatin. And then comparing those to what the rent would be affordable to a person at 80% or a household at 80% AMI. And we generally calculate that affordable rate as 30% of a household's monthly income. And then we also have what that discount would be and how much of a discount they would be applying to different units based on their size. Does anybody have any questions on this one before we move on? Or does that all?
So for example, for the 2-bedroom unit, without any incentive, that would, in the example we're using, have a rent of $2,596. At 80% of median family income AMI, that rent would be reduced down to $1,800. And that's a discount of $763. It's the biggest percentage. So this is where you get the most affordability, happens to be at 2 bedrooms, followed by 3 bedrooms and 1 bedroom. And the least extra affordability for studio apartments.
May I ask a question?
Mhm.
What sort of mechanisms are you setting up so that developers are actually providing these 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom units instead of throwing all of the affordability onto the studios?
So can I answer that, Mary, and then you can follow up?
Yep.
So a developer takes its proposal to the city and says, here's my proposal, I'm applying for MUPD. This is the mix of units I'm going to build, because presumably the city would require understanding the mix of units. These are the ones that we're proposing to have as affordable. The city can say, yeah, we think that's great. Or the city can say, yeah, no, we don't like it only being studios that are affordable. We'd like to see a mix of 2 bedrooms and whatever else. And so the city can, reject it if it chooses to. It's in really carefully setting up the criteria.
Perfect, thank you.
Mary, did I hit that right?
Yep, and I'll just add a note for our analysis that when we tested what would have happened on this building if you had MUPD in place, we did an even spread throughout all the units in the building. So we tested it as if it were applied evenly. And the building that we tested had studio, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom units.
And, just to be clear, our analysis is fairly high level. There's a lot more analysis that goes into an actual application and pro forma where MUPD is being used.
Yeah, and it might look different if it had been exclusively studio units or exclusively 2-bedroom units that had the incentive applied to it. If we go to the next slide, this is a way to think about how MUPD works. So the orange bar represents how much developer would be foregoing in rents if they provided that discount that we saw on the last slide, evenly across a mix of units in the building. So again, 20% of them at 80% of area median income. They would forego almost $250,000 in their first year of operating. And then the blue bars right next to it show what they would gain by not paying those land taxes in the same year. So
it's not land, it's also building taxes.
Land and building taxes, thank you. So the dark blue bar and the light blue bar combined show what that total incentive would be, which is a little bit over $300,000. About 50,000 of that is city taxes, and the rest is that remainder of the tax roll. So if all of those taxes were exempted, it would come out to a net of around $58,000. And that is the incentive that the program is offering to the developer if they implement those affordable units. So that's what's getting them to potentially participate in the program, that their benefit is going to be higher than that foregone revenue. If we go to the next slide, this brings it all together. And I probably should have had this on the last one. It has a little bit more detail about the building that we tested, which was a 180 unit market rate building that was constructed in Tualatin in 2017. But this brings all of those same figures together again, just to show how that negative and positive wind up with a bit of a positive gain for the developer. I want to pause and see if anybody has questions about this or the last slide and how that worked. Nothing? Okay. Beth, I think you're muted if you.
I was. I do want to point out one thing, if that's okay, on the previous slide. What if we didn't have this dark blue piece and it was only $50,000 in city taxes that were exempted? Well, 48,000, we'll just call this 250,000 because I can do that math fast. 250,000 minus 50,000 is still a negative 200,000. So there'd be no incentive. The developer would be losing 200,000 because we're asking for more affordability. So that's why it's important to get all of the different taxing districts on board so that there's actually an incentive rather than costing the developer money each year. In other words, a developer, an owner of a building is not necessarily going to lower rents as much as we're talking about if they're going to lose $200,000.
Yep, and that is again underscoring that difference between the low income nonprofit tax exemption and this one, which is trying to create a mixed income development. And if we go to the next slide, just to review some of the pros and cons for MUPTI, it does support that gap between deeper affordable housing and market rate housing and meeting the needs of moderate income households. And it also does have flexibility in that program design. So the city could decide that it had to be spread out between all of the units in the building, or potentially allow a developer to provide it only in 1-bedroom units or studio units. It also shows in our pro forma at a high level that combination of 20% of units at 80% AMI would likely provide a net benefit to developers looking for new construction in Tualatin, but that it needs that support from overlapping taxing districts in order to create an incentive that would, pardon me, get developers to more likely participate in the program. Like the nonprofit tax exemption, it also does reduce general fund revenues by exempting those taxes. It is less money that is going to the city and those other districts. And it could also be a little bit complicated to monitor, especially with market rate developers who might not typically be keeping track of income and those thresholds with AMI. Whereas nonprofit developers who might be using LIHTC credits are more likely to already be tracking that and not have additional staff capacity be used for it.
So let me give you the end answer here. A lot of people say, oh, but we need more workforce housing. Workforce housing is housing in this income level. It's also housing at, below 60% of median family income, because so many jobs are very low wage jobs. But we need more housing that's affordable in this sort of middle income. It's really hard to get developed. It, generally speaking, is not financially feasible to develop it. This is one of the few tools that cities have to support that kind of housing development, if you assume that the city doesn't have buckets of money sitting around to do this. And I don't think Tualatin has buckets of money sitting around. So this is one of the few tools, along with the construction excise tax. and a few of the other things we're talking about. Does anybody have any thoughts on this tool? Any concerns, questions? It's okay if you don't.
I think you're just doing an amazing job of explaining it.
Well, these things are hard to understand, honestly, and it takes a while to get it through.
You said it was a 20-year regulatory period, or is it annually renewed, or?
It's applicable for 10 years generally, but it can be extended for when it's used for affordable housing.
Okay.
But generally what we're talking about is a 10-year exemption.
Okay. $58,000 for 10 years, not shabby.
Not when you think that, an awful lot of what the city is lacking is, just housing that's moderately affordable. And that's so hard to get. Shall we go on to the next one? Fill your brain with a little bit more information.
Sounds good.
All right. Corinne?
All right. Thanks, Beth. Great job, Mary. The good news is I think MUPTI is probably the most complicated one we're going to discuss today. So if you're not having trouble understanding that one, I think that the next two should be hopefully not as difficult to understand. So system development charges and exemption of those charges. You can move on to the next slide. Essentially, these are charges that already exist. So when you're filing your permit or registering with the city, kind of what your project cost is, there are a series of development fees that a developer has to pay. Some of these are administered by the city, other ones are other public entities. So in the case of Tualatin, we're just going to be talking about the parks and water charges. So obviously, if you have a series of charges that exist currently on the books, one way of helping make a project pencil to make it more viable is to remove those charges. So remove some of those SDCs, the system development charges.
So Corinne,
Yeah.
can I intrude here for one moment and say why cities impose system development charges?
I'm sorry. Yeah, sure.
You guys all like parks. You like taking your kids, your grandkids, going to a park yourself, having that nice green space over there. Well, the city has to have a way to pay for that park. So acquiring new parks, doing improvement to parks, that's what system development charges are for. If you think about your water system or your road system, if you imagine, eventually you have to build a new road, you have to build a new water treatment plant or put new pipes in the ground. That's what system development charges are helping pay for. So somebody else before you are in the city paid to have, roads put in. Well, this is in the future paying for future development. Go ahead, Corinne.
Yeah, no, thank you. Exactly. And I think in the next slide, we'll get into some of those specific fees and where they're going towards. But similarly to the MUPTI, there's a little bit of, because it's the city's money, there will be some flexibility with how the city can use these funds or when it can use them, what kind of projects. So again, we're just going to focus on two specific SDCs. So if you go to the next slide. This is the parks and the water fee. The reason we're throwing these other ones on this table is to give you an idea of sort of overall the different types of development fees that exist. And in this table, you can see to the right, basically sample costs. So on a 116 unit building, that could end up being $2.5 million. These are not small fees when you have a larger kind of project happening. And to Beth's point previously, these exist for specific uses, parks, water, sewer, all the infrastructure that you are, that a project is going to be utilizing currently or in the future, and making sure that the city and these other public entities have the funds to just maintain that infrastructure. So again, in this case, we're looking at the two colors, rows there, the parks and the water, of which the parks is calculated on a per unit basis. And the water is actually, it's a little more complicated. It depends on the sort of amount of water flowing through a pipe, so the pipe diameters and such. We're going to kind of simplify that in our analysis here, but those generally are around 6,371 for per unit cost, and then around 1,143 for the water. So not a small amount of money, 7,514 per unit. That'll add up as we'll show you. So if we go to the next slide.
Before we do, I want to mention the school's construction excise tax. That's not the same thing as what cities do. It's used for the school district to support, I don't know, new student development. In other words, to support their facilities. So it's a lot like a system development charge, but it's just got a different mechanism. The Metro CET is more like the CET we're talking about for the city of Tualatin. We included the Metro and school district CETs and the sewer and transportation SDCs, so that we could look at what if the city in some way chose to exempt, which means backfill in this case, pay for all of these charges in a different way. So we've modeled that out here. But as Corinne was talking about, we're focused on parks and water because we think those are the most likely ones. I also want to hit on one other point, is there's a whole lot of law around how system development charges are set up. You can't just say, you development over there, we're exempting yours. We're just not going to charge you. And you development over there, we want to charge you. You have to do this in a very fair way so the city can backfill, in other words, pay for the system development charges in a different way, such as using its CET revenue to pay for the system development charge in a different way, so that it's not charging it to the affordable housing development. Corinne, I'll hand it back to you.
All right, we can, I think, go on to the next slide. So what we did was put together a couple sample projects, as you see, and these are obviously projects that have happened in the area. Plymouth Gardens at 116 units, Red Rock Creek Commons 48 units, Viewfinder 81 units, the Fields 64 units. That's why there's different amounts here. And I think the point we're trying to show here is this is not a small amount of money in, especially when you're thinking of all these charges that are happening. So in the first case, it ends up being around $871,000. That's not a small amount of money in a development budget, so they can actually help move the needle. I think that's around a third of the charges that go into these SDCs, or at least in development fees. So we think this is a nice kind of, I won't say easy, but this is kind of something the city controls. It adds a decent subsidy for the developer, and it's not necessarily that complicated for the developer to execute. So if we keep
So
going.
what we're saying there is that the developer isn't paying that $800,000 in the parks and the water SDCs. The city would be backfilling that in some way. So the city would want to really choose under what conditions to exempt the SDCs. So is it only for income restricted housing? Or is it for the market rate housing that we were just talking about? That's affordable up to 80% of median family income. These are things that the city would have to decide. Zachary?
Oh, sorry.
I don't have trouble getting the mute off. You mentioned a couple of times that the city would have to backfill this. Obviously, the costs the city incurs don't go away just because we're not levying these costs. I can understand moving forward for, parks. Well, we may not develop something in the future, but for sewer and other things where you're essentially paying for maintenance on wear and tear and maintaining a system, obviously those costs don't go away. What sort of backfill, what sort of mechanisms do we have available to make up that difference, especially for the ones that we're considering that are going to continue incurring a cost, regardless of if we levy the amount here or elsewhere?
I would also say that parks will continue incurring a cost because there's quite a lot of maintenance and development that has to happen in parks. But that is in a lot of ways the essential question in this project is, what are our revenue sources to pay that, in this case, $800,000? Well, if this development happened to be within your urban renewal district, urban renewal, I believe, can be used to backfill system development charges. Construction excise tax, if the city implements one, that can be used to backfill system development charges. The city could say out of its very, very big general fund, we'll pay for it there. It's not going to happen because general funds are already over allocated. So there's just not enough general fund.
Beth, may I make a point really quick?
Please.
For clarification, system development charges are very legally restricted in the way that they can be used.
Yes.
It can only be used to build new parks or to
Yes.
add on to the existing uses that are within that park. So
I thought that
some of
was
these
the
projects
case.
are coming in, and we are using these funds to help balance the budget and make this affordable housing happen. We're not adding to the infrastructure in a way that makes it so that these infrastructures can't be maintained. Oftentimes, affordable housing also has to build out a good chunk of this infrastructure. So through Half Street improvements, through adding in a sewer line if it's not already existing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just to add on and maybe clarify just for everyone's, is that we use the term internally, we call it capacity expanding improvements. So the system development charges have to actually be used in a way that expands the capacity of the system. So either by building new things or adding on so that more users can use it, whatever it is, whether it's a park or a sewer or whatever else. And then maintenance, depending on the type of utility or service, is provided elsewhere. And so, for example, like the sewer maintenance might be part of your sewer bill, for example, your retail sewer rate that you pay every month. And then in the case of parks, that's why the city's going out on the ballot for the parks bond, is because there's not a stream of revenue dedicated to parks maintenance like there is with sewer or water, because there's not a bill for it every month. And so that's a distinction there. But again, the SDC would just basically inhibit the city's ability to build new capacity. And then the other thing, I guess, to clarify about the SDCs is that, I mean, they already represent kind of a less than the amount that the city is able to charge to do future capacity enhancements as well. And so that is something that kind of suggests that, waiver of them can be appropriate in certain circumstances, because they don't represent the full ability to expand a system anyway. And so ultimately for larger scale capacity improvements, you have to look to things like grants and other kinds of funds, like in the case of park state funds, to be able to do things as well.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah. No, I appreciate all these points. I think that's what we're really hoping to get from these conversations is areas that we can continue to clarify, especially as this circles back to city council and some of the concerns they may have when it comes to the real trade-offs within some of these ideas. So just to, I think, wrap up, actually, maybe there's 2 more slides. So if we go, this one, pretty straightforward. All those developments you saw on the last slide, they tend to even out when you normalize them per unit. Again, going back to around $7,514 per unit, that would be exempted from the cost of the development, but would need to be backfilled. So, and then the final slide, it gets back to some of those pros and cons. Some of the advantages, there are criteria that the city could put into play to really guarantee certain AMI levels, et cetera, how it's used. We've seen them actually be used in other communities to be effective in terms of allowing some affordable housing projects to get built, to find the and I guess close the gap in their pro formas. And then you could argue that these aren't fees you would be receiving if the project didn't get built. So you're not necessarily losing this one-time fee if you weren't going to get it with the project that was not going to be built in the first place. Other sort of some of the trade-offs, the cons here is it's, you can only offer a certain amount of exemptions over the SDCs you can control, and can be difficult to estimate how much money would be offset given sort of complexity, for example, in these water SDCs. And the backfill question that was brought up earlier is just, okay, how this is a effective way of subsidizing a project, but it's the city typically needs to backfill those funds from a different source. The other thing I would argue is a challenge or a con is enforcement and making sure that someone is confirming if they're using an SDC, how they would be using it to guarantee those affordability levels that you would set in those criteria.
I would have to imagine you'd need a development agreement of some sort for what would be built, for waiving and backfilling, exempting and backfilling the SDCs. If you have income restricted housing, well, then you already know for sure that you'll be getting housing that is affordable, because that housing, part of its finances is usually going to be state or federal funds that require verification of incomes, and so that incomes are at or below 60% of median family income, generally speaking. So you're sort of piggybacking on the back of somebody else's verification process.
Yeah, no, exactly. Most likely this is going to be used alongside a project that's got LIHTC or something else that has those enforcement mechanisms already in place. Any questions or comments on SDC exemptions?
Is this making sense to you, Sam, what we're talking about? Okay.
I don't know if silence is a good or a bad thing in this case, but at least I think you guys are giving us the good questions in terms of how we can continue to help to describe these options. And obviously, this is going to be an iterative process. We're going to come back and discuss all these again when it comes into what you all think is the right mix when it comes to recommendations for the city council. So I guess we can keep it moving. If anyone has thoughts, they can throw it in the chat. Urban renewal is a sort of different type of tool than somewhat we've been talking about. So if we go on to the next slide, it's an old tool. It's been around actually for decades, if maybe 50s. It was state enabled, but different municipalities have used it at different capacities over the years. It's something that exists in Tualatin within a certain areas that we'll talk about, But essentially, traditionally, you draw an area. It's sort of a TIF boundary, and traditionally that has to be characterized as having certain blighted elements or some infrastructure needs. That can be sort of a different question than what we're going to get at here. And the money that's generated has to be used within this geographic area. And these are typically funds that can only be used for kind of hard costs. And so not programs, but mostly infrastructure costs, site costs. And again, we'll get into a little more detail there in a second. There are some existing TIF districts already within Tualatin. There is one that is also being contemplated now that I think is going to be more of the focus with this conversation, just because it has the most potential for housing and the ability to subsidize future housing. So I think we can go on to the next slide unless.
Just in case this isn't obvious, this is a way to pay for stuff. It's a funding mechanism. And the existing district is down in Basalt Creek.
Right.
That one's pretty much set. Can I talk about this district for a moment or two, Corinne?
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is
Beth,
Go
I have a
ahead.
quick question.
Yep.
What area we consider blighted in Tualatin?
why are we considering what?
There was something about being blighted. What areas in Tualatin are blighted?
Well, let's talk about that. We're
Okay.
looking at the downtown area. And Susan, am I right in remembering that you were part of the housing needs analysis project? You're muted, I'm sorry.
I know, I've got, oh, there we go. Can you hear me now? I was just on the Cora committee,
Yeah, so you were part of our committee.
and I was
Um,
part of
so-
2040.
Yeah. So I'm asking you that because you were at those meetings as well as I was. There was
Mhm.
just an enormous amount of discussion about the area around downtown. And to the that's east of I-5. So this is mostly a commercial district. That there was a lot of discussion and at that process about redevelopment potential in that area. And so, Robert, don't get too stuck on the word blighted and exactly what blighted means. We're not necessarily talking about something that looks like the South Bronx or something like that. We're talking about something that has certain land values and improvement values. So values of the development there. When I say values, I mean dollar values. So this area that is under discussion, it's mostly zoned some form of commercial or mixed use, and it has existing development. And so we're talking about opportunities to support redevelopment in this area, not just for housing, but for other commercial sorts of uses. And a lot of the focus of the housing needs analysis discussion, other than transportation issues, was about opportunities for redevelopment and getting things that are just a little bit taller and more housing and more of a mixture of uses. So some of the existing uses, if I called them tired, maybe that's a nicer way of putting it. But this is an area under consideration. And one of the reasons that we're focusing on this area is I think a lot of the community conversation has been, what can we do to reinvigorate downtown and the area east of I-5? Erin, do you think that that's correct? I'm portraying that correctly.
Yeah, I think you did a great job of explaining that. I think we're just kind of looking at the potential to encourage some densification in this area. And I don't know if Steve has anything he wants to add, but good job with the explanation, Beth.
Yeah, I think that covers it. I mean, I think that the key thing, Robert, to remember is that the term blight is like a legal term and it's pretty expansive and it doesn't necessarily square with like, you know, if I called my own house, if I said my house is blighted, you might think a different thing than what they mean in urban renewal terms. And so it really just means kind of an underdeveloped state where it's not necessarily reached its full potential. And I think you can obviously see that there are areas, you know, in the downtown, the former Clark Lumber site, you know, comes to mind, of course, as one of the first and foremost. Obviously, you know, things like the Hagen's that hasn't been redeveloped or repurposed at this point are some examples of that. And then in Basalt Creek, it can just be the fact that there really isn't any development. And so that's the other thing. It can just simply be a lack of development, meets that kind of legal definition. And so everything else that the other folks said is also correct as well.
Yeah. So I did want to hopefully explain a little bit of the mechanism of TIF, because I know we didn't really get into detail there, but what we've talked about with MUPTI and the nonprofit tax exemption is allowing developers to not pay certain property taxes. TIF is different. You're paying taxes, so developer is paying taxes, but what the city does is essentially borrows money on the front end to use and allocates a lot of funds that are then paid back with future property taxes. So the property taxes being generated in this yellow area are kind of bookmarked to pay back a borrowing, and that borrowing, that money, TIF borrowing is available right now to be used on infrastructure. And I guess if we go to the next slide, Beth, these kinds of uses. So again, hard costs, but also acquisition, rehab, repairs, relocations of displaced people, property, different development projects, but really typically kind of hard infrastructure costs that can be kind of large parts of the development costs for developers. So you're essentially saying, look, the city will work with you and cover maybe a large improvement that is needed in the street in front of a building, because suddenly the building is going to require new crosswalks or stoplights, or again, some of the sewer infrastructure we're talking about. TIF can typically be used to flat out cover some of those larger one-time upfront costs.
And in this district, the northern district that we're looking at, you know, unlike Basalt Creek, which, you know, needs all new infrastructure because it doesn't have water and wastewater and roads and that kind of thing. This existing area probably needs some infrastructure improvements, but there's probably also a lot more space to be talking about. Can we use this to directly support housing development? So can we use some of this funds, say, to purchase land and convey that land to an income, a nonprofit who is doing income restricted housing? Can we put money directly? Can we, you know, help the nonprofit directly fill their funding gap? Because I'm sure, as Rachel can tell you better than we can, when you're looking at income restricted affordable housing, you're usually looking at funding from, you know, 15, 20 different places, and you're scraping together all these pieces, and you still have a funding gap. And how are you going to pay for that? And well, if Tualatin had some ability to help, you know, offset, you know, fill some of that gap, then it would probably be a more attractive place for developing a little bit more income restricted affordable housing.
I'd also like to add that it's very, very helpful for the nonprofit partners. One of the things that we are scored for when we're going out for this competitive funding through the state and Metro, et cetera, is they're looking to see how much of local dollars we're able to leverage. If we can't show any investment from the jurisdiction that we're trying to build in, then that really shows that the jurisdiction doesn't necessarily want the affordable housing there, and they're going to look elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rachel. Just that it's a fight over getting some of those other funds, and the projects that have the most money in hand or that are clearly going to happen and clearly going to happen soon are oftentimes the ones that get allocated those other funding sources. So I guess we can go through a couple examples that other communities have done around this area. So if you go to the next slide.
Before we
ahead.
do, Steve, was there anything you wanted to say about the discussions about this TIF district? Or
Yeah, just a couple of things quickly, if I might. The thing, I guess, for this group to be aware is that, so the final adoption of this area has not yet been completed, but it's anticipated to be done by our city council this year, 2022, by the end of the calendar year. And that specifically within it, there is a plan priority that states that the part of the plan is to encourage and preserve affordable housing specifically. And so I think that's telegraphing that the council is on board and understands that one of the appropriate uses of TIF for this district would be that meeting that priority or that goal. And so I think to some extent, we may be looking for a more refined recommendation from this group of, pushing forward maybe some more specifics, because the plan is kind of a generalized goal without necessarily specifics of how to accomplish that. And so that's just, I think, a thing to keep in the back of your minds as you're thinking about, making a recommendation or voicing your opinion on kind of what you see as, of these choices, what you think is the most impactful, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think with some of these examples, we can get into some of the specific direction that cities took when they were authorizing their TIF plan. So I guess next slide, Beth. So for example, in Portland, they said we're going to set aside a third of all this increment. So the increment is the money that's generated from the property taxes over time. And they said we're going to set aside a third for housing. And because it's Portland, some of these are larger areas, it first 5 years generate 150 million for affordable housing and has been put to a lot of use around the city, including the example you see there, the Bud Clark Commons, 130 units. I mean, it's pretty clear cut that this is a great way of generating funds that can be used for affordable housing. And
this isn't just affordable housing, but this is transitional housing and it's supportive housing. So it's housing with services. So it's not just housing that's lower cost, but it's also helping the residents in it, get out of houselessness, and then providing services that support keeping them out of houselessness, based on whatever the issues that they had were.
Yeah, sorry, great point. And then next slide in Tiger, they set out some explicit goals to provide financial and technical assistance as well. And there's kind of proof that some projects have already utilized this and tacked it on to, like we were just talking about, the STC exemptions and some of their vertical housing tax exemptions, which we haven't talked about, but is essentially incentives to go taller to get more tax exemption. And as kind of the example here, 165 units, new multifamily housing. Again, it's more kind of proof that this money has been and can be used in Tualatin as well for different kinds of affordable housing projects. I think the last example we included here, the next slide.
Before you go on, I just want to point out that they used different tools sort of stacked on top of each other. So they used the system development exemption. They used a different property tax exemption, one that's more about mixed use here. And if I'm reading this right, Corinne, I think this is probably market rate housing that's more affordable, because it's a public-private partnership and not income restricted housing. So it's a little bit different than the last example from Portland, and Mary's nodding her head, so perhaps I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
But the important thing is to notice here is that a lot of the times you need to stack these different tools together to make things work.
Yep. And then we found another example in Redmond that, doesn't have to be huge amounts of money, sometimes just closing that gap. So in this case, under 50,000 for a project, 48 units, senior housing with community services. And to Beth's point about stacking and trying to use other sources. So for example, Section 8 vouchers, at least in the mix of how this could pencil out, and some probably preferable financing from Wells Fargo, at least their lending branch, a community lending branch. But yeah, I think overall, we're just saying that this has been used around the region quite a bit. There are trade-offs, which I guess if you go to the next slide, we can get into some of the trade-offs within the urban renewal. The obvious trade-off is that these are funds, if you put into housing versus other TIF funds might be, at the expense of, I don't know, commercial development, other things you're trying to work on. But I guess we'll touch on some of the pros here. It's a large source of funding, and it kind of gradually grows over time one of the better sources you can come up with if you're just looking for one large pot of money. As Steve noted, there's a new district in place. So in some ways, the timing is well for this kind of discussion. And hopefully we can allow you to have a little more specificity in how this could be recommended in terms of how it's been well used in other communities. We think it can also help for density. But there are some trade-offs. It does have to be used within the district. So it may be focusing a lot of funds within areas of the city that, you may say other areas outside of that district would be better served with affordable housing, et cetera. There's some geographic limitations there.
Corinne, I think that Susan has her hand up.
I'm sorry, can't see the hands. Yeah, please, Susan.
I'm sorry, I was just stretching. I didn't have my
Oh,
hand up.
you're allowed to stretch too.
That's fine too. It's been a little while. So in the existing URAs, there's not as much potential. There's just not as much residential land, and some that's already been utilized for some projects. But we think this is queued up pretty well for the TIF district being discussed. The other thing that does come into play is that these funds typically trigger prevailing wage and some of these other items that can increase the cost of the project, because if a project was not already going to pay prevailing wage, so higher wage rates that the city expects when it's putting its money into a project, that it can increase the over total development cost of a project.
And we will, I think, bring back some more examples of how this might be used as we're continuing this discussion. Steve, you were saying that is the city going to be doing the planning for the TIF district that includes estimating the potential revenues for the district? I just don't know where you are in your
They are. I mean, there's like a maximum total indebtedness for the district, and
Mhm.
I don't know what it is because they haven't necessarily fully refined the boundary yet, so that feeds
Okay.
into it. I mean, if the 150 million in Portland was 1/3 of their maximum indebtedness for that district, I want to say ours is probably no more than that total. Maybe that's 100 million maximum total indebtedness, and there's no way that it's going to get that much in 5 years. That would be like for the whole run of the district. One thing I also just would, I think, specific to TWAL, and these case studies for, while good, don't necessarily speak to one advantage of this specific to our potential urban renewal district, is that a housing project, really quite frankly, any project, but certainly a project that incorporates residents into the district, I think really has the potential to be kind of a catalyst for future development in the district, and that's kind of unique to Tualatin, but that is a potential benefit that I would specifically list. In addition,
And that's what urban renewal is really supposed to do, is catalyze that.
Mhm.
yeah, and I think I would say, just to the point that you made earlier, that most of the urban services are already there, so there's not a lot left to build, and that we haven't seen a lot of market rate housing, to me suggests that some incentivization of residential development, which this could do, would actually be potentially, building a product that the market wasn't otherwise providing, which is of course the purpose of urban renewal. And so it could be a 2-for-1 in that specifically incentivizing mixed or affordable housing as one of the earlier development concepts in the district.
When do you expect, do you have an expectation for when the urban renewal plan would be, and that's the plan that has all of the projects that would be talked about in the district. Do you have a timeline for development of that?
It looks like it's for the end of this year is kind of the long and the short of it. I'm just going to try to see quickly if I can get a. And the district, I think, is, yeah, I think I'm just trying to see if I can get a maximum indebtedness number quickly.
We can also bring that back to the next discussion.
Yeah, I think that probably makes sense. But I mean, I think that if we're talking about having the next committee meeting in January, potentially for this committee, we will have more information by that point that we can bring back to this group.
I thought we had our next meeting in, wasn't it in November? Maybe I'm just remembering.
November 16th.
Okay, well, I think we can still probably get details of what the urban renewal manager is proposing for the final, with the expectation that at this point in the year that would probably be the final, and get more information. Susan, were you stretching, or did you?
No, I wasn't. The maximum indebtedness number we looked at in core when we ended the committee was around 83 million.
Okay.
Is that the number you're looking for?
That is, yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I didn't think it was more than 100 million.
Mhm.
That makes a lot of sense for a city the size of Tualatin. And I think the other thing we'd want to ask the urban renewal manager is when he'd need some suggestions and recommendations, because we might want the next meeting to do what we're talking about doing, but also to talk a little bit more about how urban renewal could be used, so that we make sure that any thoughts that we have there could be brought into that conversation when at the right time. Steve?
I think that's a great idea. I'll say that it's not timely prior to adoption of the district, but there will be a lot of opportunity following its adoption for that. And so I think that we don't necessarily also need to rush to a consensus either.
Interesting.
Okay.
Just to put it another way, I think the plan is going to be adopted with that goal, kind of broad goal that I mentioned.
Right.
And then the intention is that future, urban planning will refine more kind of generalized like zoning and land use concepts for the district. And then that would feed into exactly what you're indicating is like, some more specifics about, given the particulars of how we envision development, how could this best be mobilized?
Can you repeat that goal? Because I evidently didn't keep it in my head.
Yes, I can. It is it's considered a planned priority as opposed to a goal. So there's priorities nest within the goals, but as a priority, encourage and preserve affordable housing.
Okay. All right. So nothing specific about specific amounts of money or anything like that. That would be
correct.
Refined to read later. Okay.
Great.
Are there questions about urban renewal? I mean, in my opinion, that's way more complicated than MUPD.
Sorry. Yeah, maybe this is more complicated than MUPD. I consider it more straightforward, but.
So I think what we want to do next time is probably bring back some ideas that are more specific about how the city could use urban renewal, and some things that you might want to put in your internal hopper for what we might be recommending a little later. If there's no questions about urban renewal or any of the other things we talked about, I wanted to talk for a few moments about the equity side of this project. Is that okay? All right, I don't want to rush anybody though. So when we talk about this is, you know, an equitable funding plan. So the idea is to increase equity, however we're defining that within the community. And one way to define equity to a certain degree is to look at equity by income level. By looking at incomes that are below average, so 80% of median family income and below, generally speaking. I think we're, you know, at the very basic way, this would increase equity, so increase access to housing that's affordable for households in these income levels. But, you know, looking beyond that, I think we should be talking about equity in terms of people who are disproportionately cost burdened, so have disproportionate levels, higher than average levels of cost burden. So that's people of color, certainly, your Latino population. It's also people with disabilities. Seniors oftentimes have disproportionate cost burden. People experiencing homelessness. If we're talking about income restricted housing, especially once you start talking about income restricted housing that's permanent supportive housing, then you're talking about helping people move permanently out of homelessness. So I think that this project should be thinking about equity, you know, beyond just income equity. This is the part that I'm the least sure about how far we'll get in this project, but I'm going to want you all to be thinking about equity and be ready to come back and talk about some of that. Does anybody have initial thoughts that they'd like to throw into the discussion bucket? We've got a lot of information about different populations and different proportions of cost burden and income. We can pull that out of the housing needs analysis.
Do we have any ability to highlight any current populations in Tualatin that meet the criteria for cost burden, or would you'd like to highlight within that equity scope that we currently have a large representation of?
So
If
for
that question makes
instance,
sense. I'm sorry.
No, that's fair. For instance, when you look at your Latino population, that's your largest community of color. I believe that we have some information that shows that Latino households are cost burdened more frequently than the average. And if we don't, that's pretty easy data to pull out of an existing system. We've got information about people experiencing homelessness. The information about them is a little scant. It's basically an estimate of the number between Tualatin and Tigard. And then we know that most people experiencing homelessness have very low incomes. But like income data for people experiencing homelessness just isn't available at the city level, for instance. But state information shows that they have very low incomes. And you know, people with disabilities, again, we know some things about them. We know the proportions of Tualatin's households that have disabilities and rates of cost burden. So Zachary, is that the kind of information you're asking for?
Yeah, more or less, just, you know, if there were any that were that we had a significant population of in Tualatin. And I also wondered if we are anticipating this construction to be something that makes Tualatin a more attractive place for people who are cost burdened to move into Tualatin, or if this is something where we're expecting people who are currently struggling to afford housing that they are currently occupying in Tualatin to shift to this more affordable housing and, thereby be less cost burdened. Just
Well,
kind of sort of think
Tualatin-
about how the population impact would be.
Tualatin, more than any other community in the region, is like smack dab in the middle. So you're very clearly part of this larger region. So I would imagine it would be both. So people who live in Tualatin being able to move to housing that's more affordable, and some people moving from within the region to Tualatin because that housing is there and it's not in other communities. There's a broader project that's at the state level that's looking at regional housing needs analysis. And it's doing this within Metro and then within many other regions in the state, and looking at ways to move cities where affordable housing, very broad speaking affordable housing, so all kinds of affordable housing, haven't been developed very much. And just to name a few names, it's places like Lake Oswego and West Lynn, Sherwood, in a different way, Happy Valley. So trying to get a more equitable distribution of affordable housing across all cities within the region. So this isn't something that is pressure on just Tualatin. It's for all of our cities in the region. Is that helpful? Susan, is that actually a hand or are you stretching there?
No, that was a hand. Just real briefly though, when we have this conversation, I can speak to our senior population and also the chamber. We look at workforce very closely for affordable housing and transportation in and out of Tualatin. So when we get into that conversation, whenever you're ready, I have information on that. Our senior population, depending on who you talk to, is anywhere from 17 to 20% of the population into Tualatin. So we play as big a part as our minority population does.
And it's only going to grow bigger.
It's only Tualatin is because it's not a real affordable community anymore. It is an aging community, and we have to. I've accepted it, but we have a lot of people that need to get on board with that, and we have to be prepared for it.
And there are certainly some people who are seniors who would be looking for opportunities to move into different types of housing. If it was available, might be market rate, multifamily housing. So I'm not saying all seniors want to do that. I'm saying that some proportion of them, and that, having more of that kind of housing allows people to age in place, and having more low income affordable housing that seniors can access allows them to age in place in their community.
We just had that conversation Monday at my aging task force committee meeting that it's getting harder and harder to age in place and stay in your home, and what's available and how do you move out, and how do you find where you want to live, and what you can afford. There are a lot of obstacles, and certainly transportation plays a big part of that. A lot of seniors give up their cars, so they have to be able to live near transportation of some sort or be walkable. There are a lot of issues, and seniors aren't the only ones that experience those issues.
Yeah.
A lot of groups do. We just we speak up.
You're just a bigger group. People with disabilities often have similar sorts of issues. And I don't necessarily know that the kind of housing we're talking about all has to be the same kind of housing. I mean, if you're looking at income restricted housing, generally speaking, that's going to be multi-story, multi-family housing. But can you look at opportunities for more affordable cottage housing? We'll be talking about rehabilitation loans or grants when we meet next for households that exist as a way to stabilize the households. Or you could look at down payment assistance programs to help people get into housing for low income households. So it's not all it's not a monolithic housing type. It could be a range of housing types.
It could, and even, this generational housing where we need to get back. I'm not going on a soapbox here, but when you're talking about housing, you need to think about that, the multi-generational housing housing where we become more connected with each other and help each other, especially if you're downsizing or you're not in a position to afford more than what's being offered in low income or affordable housing. There's a great lot by the police department where a little village of tiny houses with gardens and meeting places, for that. We have to think bigger of how we're going to live than we're thinking right now. So
No, I fully agree. And if you look at something like duplexes or tris or quads, those could somewhat easily be multi-generational housing
Mhm.
types. Rachel, do you have anything to add as your perspective as a developer of affordable housing?
Yeah, we absolutely love the idea of doing multi-generational housing. It is really hard to get funded because everybody wants money right now.
Mhm.
We're actually in the process of proposing a project that would be going into Southwest Portland that will have 2 and 3 bedroom units paired with 1 bedroom units or studios. So that way we can actually try to get generational housing into it. There's been some really successful projects. Bridge Meadows does really great work around multi-generational housing.
Mhm.
Could you bring us a little bit of information about 1 or 2 of those things that you think are successful as they relate to especially increasing equity other than just income equity?
Yeah, I can actually give you a great example now, which is a project that we're working on. It's still very, very early proposal stage, but it would actually be partnering with Vienna Star and working to bring multi-generational housing into farm worker housing.
Very interesting. Perhaps we'll follow up with you if that's okay.
Yeah, happily.
So Rob, I haven't heard much from you. Do you have any thoughts on this? You don't have to if you don't.
Not too much. I mean, I had already had messaged with Aaron previously because I was concerned about cost increases on rent. Because I'd seen, where the state had allowed us a 14% increase in rents, but yet on low income, though, a lot of people were complaining because they got a 50% increase on their rent on low income. So, we're going to be able to keep, affordable housing for the people. The landlords are going to raise them.
Yeah. So that preservation of affordable housing is that's a tough one. Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a glimpse of some of the stuff we'll be talking about in the next meeting.
I have a question. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I hope this isn't silly. What if we have systems in place that developers have to come in and they get the tax credit to have part of their development affordable housing, and they don't want to do it? Can they come in and do their own development, or do they have to? Are they going to have to follow whatever rules get in place?
What you're talking about is more inclusionary zoning. So in Portland, there's, I don't know the details because I haven't looked at the details, but there's a requirement that developments that in each building that have more than 19 units per building, so 20 units or more, have to include some amount of affordable housing. And I forget the proportion of it.
Mhm.
That is a required program. What
Okay,
we're talking about with MUPD, some people call it voluntary inclusionary zoning. So it's not a required program. A developer says, I want that tax incentive because I think I can build in a way that's a profitable project, even with whatever percentage of the housing being affordable at say 80%. And these are arbitrary examples that we've given you. The city can set it up very differently than this. And the developer decides, I'm going to submit an application. I understand the city's criteria. I'm going to submit an application, and the city council reviews it and decides to approve it or not. And there's lots and lots of different ways to set up that program. So for instance, Eugene and its multi-unit property tax exemption, it requires the developer to submit a pro forma, so financial analysis that shows that the property tax exemption is necessary to make the development financially feasible. Like it can't happen without the property tax exemption because the numbers just don't pencil. And I happen to know that Eugene's staff has staff who know a lot about pro formas and are pretty good at spotting things that are untrue because their staff used to work for us. So I know them very personally. So I expect they're doing a realistic review of the pro formas. I think Bend is going to implement the same sort of requirement. I don't know if other cities are implementing that requirement. But that way you can make sure, as sure as you can ever be, that the tax exemption is being used to support development of housing that wouldn't happen otherwise.
okay,
That's meeting the city's goals.
thank you.
Mhm. Are there other questions? So, Corinne or Mary, do you have anything else to add?
No, I guess, we're throwing a lot at you in terms of all these different tools. Is the way we're framing it making sense in terms of pros and cons and sort of sample projects, or is there anything else that we could do to help you kind of understand how these things work?
Understanding that
so-
there will be repetition and answering questions. I'm sorry, Susan.
I was just gonna say, from when we started at 5:30 till now, I'm feeling much more comfortable about the conversation. So I think y'all have done a great job so far. Thank you.
Well,
And
yeah.
I think one of our good qualities is we'll answer all your questions as far as we can. So. Steve or Aaron, do you have anything to add?
I do have a question. Have we
Oh,
looked at-
please.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Have we looked into anything like for home ownership? I know in Kentucky, when I was living there in Lexington, my wife and I were able to buy first-time home buyer. They had torn down the old projects, the old apartments down there and redevelopment. And we were able to buy in, certain income level, and we would be able to buy into a house. And we kept that house anyway till we moved here. So I don't know if we're just looking at apartments or if something like that, we're going to be able to get into home ownership for some of our people.
So what we're looking at next time is cities that have programs to support home ownership. So rehabilitation programs. So, my roof on my house is terrible and it's going to be $20,000 to replace it. And, the city has a program to help me deal with that. Just the word, down payment assistance. That's the word. And if you have a construction excise tax already, 15% of the revenues from that go to the state to support their home ownership programs and come back to the city through the state. So if you have a CET, that's already happening a little bit, but it could happen more. So yes, that is on the list. Not quite the way they did it in Kentucky. Steve and Aaron?
No, I don't have anything. I'd just like to thank everyone for your participation this evening. There were some great questions and great comments.
All right. Well, we'll see you back here in, I don't know, I think it's like a month or 5 weeks. And we'll bring you back more information and have more good discussion.
Well, happy Halloween and happy Veterans Day, which is next month,
Indeed.
Yeah.
Definitely.
the 11th.
Of next month, yeah. Yep, and we won't be talking until after that, so, yeah.
Good night.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.
Yeah, good night.
Thanks, everyone.